Hey guys, Mark Allen, BH Spring Solutions, and happy Friday. Welcome to the live stream. Now, I don't have any idea why I'm hearing it, but I'm hearing myself talking back through my own speaker. So that was interesting. Hey, if there's anybody here in the live stream, if you hit me a thumbs up, thank you, Jay. Thank you for showing up, my friend, very much. And um, I just want to make sure audio on your end is coming through because unfortunately it's coming right back and feeding right back to me, like repeating itself for myself. Give me another thumbs up if everything sounds okay on your end and you're not hearing me twice. Hopefully. Okay. Well, one more time. Thumbs up. Perfect. Perfect. Okay. Welcome. Just finished watching the Belgium Spain soccer match, and I'm definitely not a soccer fan or an authority at all, but was kind of sentimentally hoping that Belgium would pull that off, and they did not. Mainly because Belgium actually has a lot to do with our live stream today, and the subject of Belgium has a lot to do with our live stream today. So, and they did eliminate the United States, and you kind of want to see someone who eliminates you, go ahead and win the whole thing. So at least you can say, you lost ultimately to the world champions or whatever. But so anyway, that was too bad for Belgium there to be eliminated today as well. And hopefully we're going to have some more people showing up here in the live stream here in just a little bit. And if not, and if you happen to be watching this on the replay version, um, thank you also for tuning into this. Um, we're gonna start this conversation about the high power and specifically this question. Why did Browning discontinue the high power? And the short answer to the whole picture is uh, I don't think Browning had any real say so or any real choice in the matter. Um, the high power itself was not. It was a it's kind of a little complicated actually. Um, it was considered to be covered by John Browning's last patent, and which is extremely loosely applied, honestly. Um, and John Browning's last patent, we affectionately call the 1927 Grand Rendiment, was a patented design in the United States, um, and that was really what sort of applied to the P-35 as we know it today, and as it came to be. But John Browning did not design a lot of it, and some of it, for example, firing pin retain plate, magazine release, these things. Some of the other concepts and things that are in the 1911 patents, um, plural, um, it had to apparently expire before Dieudonné Safe could actually use those things and apply them into, the ultimately what in their minds, a double stack magazine, 9 millimeter semi-auto, and which was originally, as far as I understand, called the P-35 by FN. And there really was not any historically. Um, there was not any uh, Browning high power per se, if I'm not mistaken. I believe until the sometime in the 50s was the high power actually seen as Browning Arms Company product. So you kind of have this period from the point of 1935, and there's this new semi-auto pistol And, at that time, it had, two great attributes and things going for it. And the things I'm talking about are it really was, superior to just about anything else that money could buy at the time. Highly, highly sought after um, technology, highly sought after production, so much so that Hitler took over the plant in Belgium, FM's plant in Belgium, during the German occupation of Belgium in World War II. And what happened was Dieudonné Save got out of Dodge. And what we find is this was the first moment that the high power origin technology was considered and deemed to be something of uncommon value. In other words, when Dieudonné Save got out of Dodge, got out of Liège or Erstal, um, the origin blueprint and any copies or anything, whatever, went with him, and he, got out of there and went to Britain. And uh, this was a lot of times when you hear today, that the Nazi occupation, high power production, which is quite collectible actually, um, is not to the standards of FN. Well, that's true. They had, a lot of FN, employees that, became, whatever the company was when it was occupied by Germany and being administered by them. Um, so without the blueprints, basically they had the tooling and they had the workers who ran the tooling and assembled the firearms. But what they did not have was they did not have um, the blueprint technology, which is really all of the high powers. Um, uh, I call it the book of insanity. It is it is like it is the blueprints for the Swiss watch of firearms. Frankly, more tighter, critical. You can't do anything else if you don't hit tight tolerances. That, quite honestly, the real story of the high power um, isn't so much John Browning, and honestly, it's not so much Dieudonné Save because the more that my partner Slav and I have, come to know high power history and Leon Hubert, FN's last designer who really did anything at all with the high power pistol, um, became our designer and is now with us. Um, we didn't really have a lot of appreciation for uh, Dieudonné Save's lacking. Well, um, he was no John Browning, not by a long shot. And there's things inside the high power pistol that Leon Hubert has corrected, that BH Spring Solutions has corrected or upgraded or modified, that would not be something that we could have turned into like our playground if they had not left a lot of the table, number one, and if Dieudonné Save's work was not um, lacking in so many ways. You wouldn't even be hearing me right now, and we wouldn't even be having this live stream, and there would not even be a BH Spring Solutions. Um, it's extremely hard to get into and stay in my opinion, a firearms business that's devoted to, say, modifying, upgrading, perfecting, customizing, um, making masterpieces, things of this nature. If there's not room for improvement, if there's not opportunity, to make this your playground, the 1911 world is extremely tough. And I'll tell you one reason why it is because there's so little, John Browning's original design of the 1911 leaves on the table, that you can, much improve on. Uh, in one example would be the high power SFS system. Leon Hubert redesigned the Sear because he could, and because the original high power sear is definitely not optimal, and it had room for improvement. He improved it. And that sear is a component in the SFS kits for the high power pistol. For the 1911, he didn't try to improve John Browning's sear. It, it, and you reuse the 1911 sear when you put in a 1911 SFS system. So Dieudonné Save's work had a lot of marginal stuff, and the high power pistol, in its original P35 form and in its final form that was discontinued by FN and Browning, guys, I'm just going to tell you, there's a lot of marginal design work contained in that handgun, and it shows. And it has been the high power's Achilles heels, from extremely difficult and challenging to manufacture and produce well, as I think a lot of the Turkish imports have evidence at this point. Um, from that to parts and components that are limited life by design because of captured springs that can't be replaced. Um, uh, and then various other things. Uh, this idea that you slam a barrel into a crossbar, or slam a barrel cam lug into a locking lug cam, um, is frankly, compared to the elegance of locking link, swiveling piece of art on the barrel of a 1911. um, by comparison, this is admittedly rather crude design work, frankly, and it's copied. CZ copied it in the CZ75. They did the very same thing, having a barrel slam into basically the slide stop, acting as a locking lug cam, or as what the barrel runs into, and just literally slams it into the slide stop. And again, those slide stops have had a little bit of a reputation for fracture, and it's like, well, no kidding, what it's being asked to do. And so there was a lot of downsides with the high power from the get-go and from the very beginning. And the other thing that is so noteworthy is everything about economics, everything about the balance, everything that you hear and still hear today, and it's still just as relevant today when they say, "Oh, it points so naturally, feels like a natural extension of my arm." I can't tell you the number of times at shooting ranges and in my own backyard shooting range, someone who's never shot a high power before shoots mine, or one of mine or whatever, and the reaction is always virtually the same. And you start to see this, sort of falling in love look in the eyes because it is a truly pleasurable firearm to shoot, like most John Browning designs are. Much of the grip frame angle, the balance that was planned into the 1927 Grand Regiment did carry to the P35, and that, what do you say, almost feels like a natural part of my hand when I've got the right grip panels on it, and it's still that is all of John Browning's everything he learned in his life. Talking to your hand, your arm, and your emotions, your reactions when you go, man, that is so good. And you're not imagining it, because that is one of the attributes of the high power that is extremely, extremely seductive. And at the time in 1935, those two things: one, this is just a pleasure, fun, enjoyable, makes you feel good because you can shoot it well, usually, the first time you've ever touched one, was and is a very, very seductive trait of the handgun. And I will tell you, by 2026, technology and manufacturing standards and our computerizations and everything, what FN did when they pulled off production for the P35 was unlike anything, in my opinion, they had ever done before. Nothing that John Browning had ever handed them was as complex and as tolerance sensitive, like chronically tolerance sensitive all over the entire pistol. And if you don't hit those tolerances, you don't function. They had not undertaken a handgun, in my opinion, prior to 1935, like the high power, in terms of its sophistication, in terms of its complexities to produce and manufacture well. This was taking things to a new level. There is a lot of modern machinery today, guys, that have a very difficult time holding the required tolerances, of origin high power technology, the origin high power blueprints. To have pulled it off in 1935 would have been, number one, an incredible investment, to manufacture that. Now that you're going to manufacture this gun, they inevitably would have had to have also designed and manufactured a boatload of tooling in order to specifically make the specific parts, components, frames, slides in the high power pistol. And it was, again, unlike anything that they had ever undertaken before. So, the one of the great, maybe the most noteworthy point in high power history of a company defying gravity, literally, to make a handgun, it would be FN in Erstal, Belgium, and their efforts to bring the 1935 to market in the first place. Um, there's no, even still today, the origin high power technology is unavailable. You're not going to find it on the internet. You're not going to find it. If you find it for sale in the black market, it undoubtedly is not real. And uh, it has been to this day. It's just not available. Um, Leon Hubert had a special relationship with FM when he left in 1993, and he also happens to be the guy that blueprinted the Mark III version of the high power, which retained a lot of the very origin technology, with some changes. And he also optimized some things, throughout the pistol at that same time, that he did the Mark III blueprints. But because Leon is with us, yes, that's technology that we have access to. And once we did, we're looking at this and going, holy cow. It's mind bending that FN ever pulled this off. And I know in the live stream world, the video making world, and everything, if you're a company that doesn't badmouth somebody, and you actually make a big effort not to do that, apparently that doesn't sell well, because it seems like that's what everybody wants to hear. The controversy and the stuff that makes your blood pressure go up or down or whatever. And and we don't do that. And we also know that safety is not the greatest seller in the whole world either. And so we don't take it personal. It's just our lot in life, so to say. And but I want to tell you another thing. The high power pistol is so, what I call, seductive, and addictive, that I still remember the first day that my most of my experience was with Browning long guns. And at this time, I'm about 22 years old, and I had experience with a couple lesser handguns that I had ultimately traded, and then finally, to the first high power that actually I still use as my personal carry high power today. That doesn't have one original part in the whole gun, but it's the frame of the slide is the same. It's got about 40,000 rounds on the frame of the slide, and that firearm. It has an awful lot to do with why BH Spring Solutions happened. And then you think hindsight's 2020. I can distinctly remember on multiple occasions in those days, especially in the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years of owning that high power, and I'm not sure it ever quit. Every time I would shoot it, I would have this flash through my head, and I would think this exact thing. If I could ever figure out how to make a living doing something with this gun, I think I'd really enjoy it. And I've never, honestly, in my entire life, I've never had that kind of inclination, other than songwriting, singing, and performing, perhaps. But I could see myself doing that as well. But I had that inclination about the high power pistol every time I handled it, every time I went shooting, every time I experienced it. I just was so just unbelievably impressed, um, and specifically, the handling experience. The moment that I first got one in my hand in a gun store where I traded the 38 special I had before that, um, as soon as it hit my hand, I felt like I was holding something John Browning had designed, and that sense is real. I have since come to understand that is not imagined. That is real with a high power pistol. And it's inescapable, frankly. There's nothing still today in that feels in my hand the way uh, a Browning high power does. And I attribute that completely to John Browning and to FN. Diodone save, secondarily because he left that part alone. Okay, so the the high power becomes like um, the worlds have to have sidearm militarily and police forces, and there is one thing that the entire high power picture hinged on, that I think I can say this without too much risk of missing the bullseye on this one, guys. Um, Especially because of the complexities, the tooling necessary and required uh, to make the full firearm well, um, the kind of Swiss watch preciseness of a lot, the whole doggone gun actually, um, is unprecedented, and uh, it would be the kind of thing that once you got into it, you might start thinking, well, we're doing it this time, but we're never going to do this again. It is that sort of a mountain to get over. Um, so and to do it as well as they did, and they did it at a level that, frankly, I personally regard as being the highest level in history of all the manufacturers who ever made a high power, the highest level manufacturing of the high power pistol itself, in my opinion, did happen at FN. Um, the FN Browning Mark III high power, I believe, to be the finest high power pistol of history, especially with V8 Spring Solutions upgrades in it. Um, so kudos to FN for ever pulling this off in the first place. But as you can imagine, as I've talked about these sort of marginal aspects, um, and especially the complexity of producing the handgun well, um, your only redemption in that equation is volume, and a lot of it, and they got it, and the world wanted it, and 92 countries ended up having it either in their military, security forces, or their police service, and literally just all over the world, even in some special forces, and I believe CIA or Secret Service, or one of those soup agencies, or more than one, I believe, you know had high powers at one point, and the 1911, its longevity, and Browning's genius in the 1911. It didn't mean that the United States would like FN to have gone ahead and come over here and made high powers. It's just they had these 1911s that lasted so long they didn't need them, and they had a bigger cartridge, and that was the big deal. And I never got the inclination that in those days, and I'm talking about 50s, 60s, 70s, wasn't any notion that the high power wasn't wanted by those types of folks in the United States. It was just they didn't have a big need for it. So um, somewhere in the mid 50s, I think 55, if I'm not mistaken, Browning picks up high power um, as a model that they would brand the Browning high power. And that started, civilian sales in the United States and the availability of the high power. And in these days, the one also saving grace for the high power is that after World War II, there was really never really a letdown in military procurements too much like there was after World War One, which was the war to end all wars, and nobody thought they needed any more guns and whatever, and there just weren't a lot of things going on. um, After World War II, things, sales wise for the high power, it kept going TikTok, and FN's volume in high power production um, went TikTok really, really, really well, and so well that FN decided that they needed new tooling, and this would have been somewhere in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. And so they sold off their original tooling, and it went to FEG in Hungary, and along with it would have gone a version of Origin technology. Again, and I'll be talking about that, several times, because it has a role in this whole picture of why did the high power get discontinued. But the one thing that I think is key to understand here in this whole picture is volume. Is FN was dependent on volume, and they got it, and it built their company. Quite frankly, I mean, the other things did too, but high power production was their what was FN in those days. And when you get penetration into 92 countries, plus the U.S. civilian market, you're doing good. And they were rolling very much, and it was at that in those days there was no risk to FN, selling off their original tooling so high powers could be made in Hungary because the world could not get enough. And there was another market, so they licensed FEG in Hungary. Uh, their original tooling went there. They started, they built even better tooling for themselves to continue making the FN and Browning high power, and so now, they're being, happening in two places. While Dieudonné Save was exiled in Britain, when Germany, became Belgium, um, the he blueprinted another pistol called the Inglis, which started being produced in Canada for Canada and for Britain. And but that's a different set of blueprints again. And the point and the whole reason we know that they kept doing this. In other words, FEG got the original tooling, but they didn't make Browning high powers. They made uh, a modified version. In other words, um, this these little micro changes all over the pistol, frankly, that some of them are meaningful, some of them are not. And that tooling was already old when it went to Hungary, and a lot of the FEG production, it shows that it was old because you find some interesting tolerances, but everything works. And and but the technology that goes to Hungary, the technology that went to Inglis, even if it was in your hands, you still don't have the Origin technology precisely for the Browning high power. So they protected that Origin technology related to the FN high power, and did not dilute or degrade the integrity of or the significance of the FN high power by doing what they did. Um, they did the very same thing in Argentina. That was again, but it's again altered blueprints that hide the original high power. So their dependency on volume seems to be not a big issue. And we're getting into the 60s, and into the early 70s, And now there's licensed production happening in, had been happening in Canada at Inglis, and I think somewhere in the 70s, Inglis goes bankrupt. Thing tooling and blueprints and everything go to India and Rifle Factory Ishapur, who, by the way, is still making the last we heard about 18,000 Ishapur 1A, which is the Inglis high power, and doing a fantastic job with the same tooling that was in Canada back then. But they have only ever let 500 of those out for export to the U.S. as far as our understanding is. And so at this point, the world is getting fed high powers by FN in Belgium. They're getting fed high powers by Inglis in Canada or Ishapur in India. Followed that, BG in Hungary, and then now we're into the 70s, and we've got FM in Argentina coming online, and the world cannot get enough high powers, and FN is rocking. And they are making all the high powers they can personally make. They are the ones who, for example, except for the Argentinian military, FN is still, producing high powers for the world basically, and they are the main provider, and they're the ones with the institutional customers, and this was such a all-encompassing handgun in these days, and it was carrying so much of the FN weight of the time that when Léon Hubert designed the BDA 380, the Browning BDA 380, also known as the FN 140DA, FN wanted the gun. They wanted the gun. They wanted to be able to sell it, because there were still police in Europe that wanted 380s. They knew they had a natural market, for double action, single action like the BDA 380 is. And, they loved it, and they had no place to produce this. So that's why it got shopped and subbed out basically to Beretta, because they didn't have any place, they didn't have any production capacity to add that handgun, and it's the reason why they didn't. So, and that again, that is bringing you into the first half of the 70s, and that's what the picture for the Browning high power is like. And the high power remains dominant, into 1980, and we're about to get to where this, train starts to, kind of go off the tracks. Let me give you a little bit more of a backstory. In 1958, Léon Hubert joins FN in Herstal, Belgium. And he started out, it was a very short time in aircraft engines, and they moved him over to handguns and firearms. And Léon Hubert's first credited firearms design is the FN competition model. And Jay in the chat here, he has one. Many of our BH veterans actually have that particular model. That's Léon Hubert's first handgun. And a lot of people think, well, it's just a longer barrel high power. No, it's a different gun. Completely redesigned magazine disconnect, re-leveraged and designed steer lever, which lightens the trigger pull. Yes, longer barrel. But the real genius part of that handgun is he installed or designed a different barrel bushing that is an absolute work of art, and it absolutely holds that barrel just dead solid rock still. And when the bullet leaves the end of the barrel, it's leaving the end of a barrel that is immovable. It is just a treat. Dissect one of those FN competition models, which again is very much a different gun than your standard 35 or high power pistol. And that was Léon Hubert's first firearm design for FN. And so that was 58. And then in the early 70s, he has the BDA 380, that he designs, which is, again, a gun that I mistook for a John Browning design when I first owned one in the early 90s. And but later found out it was Léon Hubert who designed that. And so we get to 1980, and you got a couple things going on. One, FN is still rocking the house with, you know, sales, licensed production that they're, getting, greased by, and there are United States pistol trials in the air that are, being rumored and talked about, and it looks like these things are going to go that way, and the U.S. is going to be looking for a new handgun. And I believe that when the new decade started in 1980, I think the entire firearms world believed that naturally the high power pistol would be coming to America, and be the next handgun, the next handgun for the United States military. And I think it probably was assumed, when the decade started in 1980. And of course, as we know, it didn't go that way. But here's the things that are very, very, very key in terms of understanding here, especially again because of that. Um, hey, thanks for the question, and I'll get right to that one here, just real quickly. Um, by 1990, a few very, very noteworthy things had happened. Um, One, the world had figured out what the CZ-75 was, because that came out from behind the Iron Curtain, and it, immediately impressed people. It had been in the air. The Soviets had this great handgun that was better than everybody else's handgun, and it was top secret for so long and whatever. And that hit the market and started to become available, which was an instant attraction, primarily because you had Eastern European, wages involved with production, which made it very economical. And that was one noteworthy thing that happened. Also in 1980, something happened called Glock, which the world didn't know that was coming at all. And the notorious, I think they said, and still do, maybe, that the Glock grip frame, the plastic grip module itself, cost $4 to make, and had to compete with that. You're making grip frames for $4, and I'm telling you right now, what it takes to make a high power grip frame is unreal. And it couldn't have been, substantially much better back in those days either. But they had volume working for them, and as a lot of you business owners are going to understand, volume solves a lot of problems. It covers a lot of sins, and it makes up for a whole lot of deficiencies if you've got enough of it. And that is literally what they had, and they were riding it, and it had to have looked like in 1980 this was a train that was never going to end. Well, okay, so there's sort of this string of things that happened. The CZ-75, the Glock, they did not come out of the U.S. pistol trials as the winner. But what even worse in that picture is, if you take a look at the Beretta 92 that won the 1984 pistol trials, and you just take a look at a blueprint or a schematic, and take a look at the schematic of Leon Hubert's BDA 380, and you tell me that the Beretta 92 would ever have existed without Leon Hubert. No way. There is too much copycat work that went into the Beretta 92 that is basically copycat work directly from Leon Hubert, who was, of course, at FN. So this would have had to have been a very sort of sour chain of events that FN found themselves in this dilemma in. And so, all of a sudden there's this thing called the Beretta 92 that won the, United States pistol trials. And that's obviously that's going to get some attention elsewhere in the world as well. And it got a lot of attention in the civilian market, and the Browning high power had not ever been, particularly super strong in the civilian market in the United States. It was popular, but not to the degree that you think of today as a Glock being popular, or as the 1911 still. Never that sort of level of penetration in the United States market, which was nothing like the concealed carry market we know today. So all of these things, kind of, in a convergence. And one of the things that Leon Hubert mentioned to Slav and me one time when we were, meeting with him and talking to him, was of course, we had all these questions. Well, why didn't FN ever do this? Why didn't FN do that? Why didn't they do this? Why did they leave, this on the table? Whatever. And he literally, um, Leo Hubert is a very, very soft-spoken and very, you don't get a lot of emotional cues from him very often. Um, and it's the only time I've ever really seen him even this animated. And he said, because they would not consider, pardon me about that, I was fighting it. They would not change anything. They would not listen. Apparently, in FN's history, there was a point, and I can understand why this would be such a rub, where somebody had a bright idea once upon a time to mess with one of John Browning's designs, and apparently they did. And it must have cost the company badly or a lot of money or something, but it didn't work out, obviously. And so from that point, there's just you don't go messing with the designer's designs. And the high power was not a John Browning design, really. It was a Dieudonné Save finished. It was a Dieudonné Save design. As the responsible party, and he should not have been held in as such high regard that they became, this very stiff-spined, just carte blanche attitude. Like, this is rule number one: you don't mess with the designers. It doesn't matter what it is. Don't say the designer has any faults or has any, whatever. So, and hey, after your chief, designer had been John Browning, who can blame them for, sort of taking on that sort of a commandment? You don't believe me. It's a bad idea to attempt or design anything that goes against anything that Browning ever said, wrote into a patent, or whatever. You can try to defy it, and you will pay, and it's inevitable. And so they had great grounds in history for not wanting to argue with the designer about his stuff or try to improve it or make it better or whatever. But unfortunately, that was misdirected with the high power specifically, because it did have a lot of room for improvement. And I would say that was one of the Achilles heels of FN and the high power design as FN and Browning, as FN produced it, is it kept the high power from being all that it could be. It kept the high power from being as competitive as it could have. When you have a reputation that the FN high power had worldwide, there's a point when that reputation precedes you and you don't have anything left to prove. And nobody else is comparing, time after time after time after time. And you start getting orders just because of who you are, what you are, because of your reputation, and everybody knows that they're going to be happy with, whatever they buy from FN in the way of a high power. So things changed. The entire landscape changed between 1980 and 1990. Man, I'm telling you, this is like looking at, from FN's perspective, it had to have been looking at two different entire worlds. Now, I'm convinced the only reason that there were changes on or around, starting really in 1988 and completing in 1989, in the form of Leon Hubert's, redesign or Mark III high power, with your drop safety steer lever, your ambi safety, your dovetailed sights, your straightened feed ramp barrels. The reason that these things happened is I don't think they had a choice. The world was running towards Series 80 in 1911, things being drop safe so that they don't have bullets leaving barrels when they shouldn't. I think the attorneys, more than anything, inspired FN to make the changes that they made. And those were changes, honestly, that as far as I've ever known, the last substantial FN high power military contract as far as I've been able to find. The last real substantial one, not that there weren't some smaller ones, but the last real substantial one was with Israel for high powers, for their defense forces, and um, Israel did not want the Type 2 sear lever. They were already fracturing so many frames, or sorry, so yeah, frames, but they were already fracturing so many slides, and they were already destroying so many barrels, and it's hotter than yours ammunition that they insist on shooting that was destroying them. And FN by this time was sending skids of replacement slides and replacement barrels to one and only one place, and that was Israel. And uh, and the last and in their last contract of new high powers that were purchased by Israel from FN, they got Type 1 sear lever bottles, not the Mark III version. They didn't want it. Their attitude was we're already fracturing so many slides that uh, that more metal taken out of the slide is going to be a bad thing. So they didn't want those. So okay, so that's what the landscape looks like in 1990. Is the orders are not coming in anymore. The volume, the all important volume for the high power design was not happening. Um, Today, even with the insane disparity of currency exchange between the United States and Turkey, and the difference in what it costs to pay a skilled factory worker in Turkey compared to the United States, which is the reason why they're making high powers there and selling them for what they are. But one of the things that you've noticed and you have seen is even they are relying on volume. I mean, we're estimating that over 200,000 high powers have come into the United States since the Springfield SA-35 Gersan, Inglis and Century imports have been coming in. It may be over 200,000 all combined. But again, this along with it being a flood and a complete oversaturation of the market, in my opinion, it is also a strong testimony to, if you're going to produce this thing, you better produce volume, because the pitfalls that come with producing this handgun are such that you are only going to be able to cover that with volume. Okay, I'm going to stop here around 1990 because this is when the future of the high power pistol becomes extremely, extremely critical to understand why was the high power pistol discontinued in 2018 by Browning, and we're going to be getting to that. I want to run to the comments here real quick because we did have a really good question. Can you explain the difference between the sears in the competition versus standard that gives a lighter pull? It's not the sear, although the sears they had, I believe, based on the sears that we've looked at with magnification and out of a competition model that was not shot very much, other standard high powers that had about the same round count, it appears they definitely did another finishing step on the sears, but it was only in the form of simple polishing, not anything invasive, to change the dimension or the shape or anything of the sear. The sears definitely did not have machining marks on the engagement face. The edges, the disengagement edge was sort of nicely civilized, I guess you'd say. Definitely not like at quote edge, but what they did, or what Leon did to make that trigger pull so sweet, is you think of your sear lever like a teeter totter, if it's a Type 1 or a Type 2, and it goes like that, and it's on an axis. And if you have a fat kid here and a skinny kid here, and if you make the fat kid move up the teeter totter, you give the skinny kid out here at the end of the teeter totter more leverage that way, and all of a sudden this thin kid out here, who happens to be the trigger lever, now starts to have more authority over the resulting weight that he has to displace on the other end of the teeter totter by moving him up the axis. Leon moved the pivot point. So it gives the trigger, the skinny guy, more authority feeling over that teeter totter of the sear lever, and it created a naturally lighter trigger pull because he leveraged the force of the trigger differently, and more in favor of the trigger. That's the really big secret in the competition model. Another very noteworthy thing was, um, Leon Hubert. I want to tell you, the magazine disconnect redesign that only appears in the competition model because for whatever reason, they wouldn't dawn on anybody. No, you can't change anything about this. Being the standard high power by Leon. And this is the completely ironic thing, because I've always thought, if there is such a thing as reincarnation, and John Browning came back, as somebody else, what would he do first, or what would he do for an encore? And I've always thought, well, he'd shore up all of the deficiencies or marginal in the high power, and that's really what Leon did. Because there's nothing you think about it, there's nothing in the competition model that could not have been well adapted over to a standard high power. It doesn't cost any more to make a sear lever with the holes drilled here or drilled there. And they could have done this. They didn't have to have 9.5 pound triggers out of the box, until, the gun was discontinued. They never had to have that. They knew how to have better, but they just, if you want to use the words bullshit, whatever it was, they were immovable to making changes to the high power pistol. They almost got there one time, not from this direction, but from another one that I'll explain to you. The redesign of the magazine disconnect by Leon Hubert in the competition model is an elegant, genius work of art, and the magazine presses in like it's like a paddle, and it moves like this when the magazine goes in, and that causes the trigger lever to move to its rearward position, and nothing about the trigger pull is invaded by that magazine disconnect. It's completely uninvasive because it's just not involved. It's a different, separate entity to the trigger, its movement, and its action itself. And it is just a work of art. And I have to tell you, I don't believe John Browning would have done it any different or better, or could have, because it is a little piece of genius, and it was a foreshadowing or foretelling of what Leon Hubert was going to do, in the future, I think. So that the same thing, the slide barrel bushing in the competition model, rather than being this eighth wonder of the world, geometric piece that's brazed into the end of the slide, Leon Hubert designed it is a spring, but it's no spring in the conventional sense. It's a thick piece of metal that is sort of like this, and that's the way I can explain it, is it cradles the barrel perfectly. It allows you the angle to go in to install that long barrel, and because it is effectively, when the barrel is seated in the slide, it is effectively a spring, and it is retaining the barrel in its dead still position. Again, this is a total work of art. I see no reason why a version of that could not have been put in every high power. I think they would have found the high power pistol far easier to manufacture, frankly. Both of these changes, the magazine disconnect and the slide barrel bushing in the competition model, these are John Browning-esque design works of art. And this is, in Leon Hubert's quite early days at FN, as a young guy. And by the way, Leon Hubert, if I'm not mistaken, I believe was born in 1940. and which would loosely make him like the age of I see, like the age of I guess a grandson to John Browning, in essence. Um, and so that's the that's the generational reference. Um, but he just started out designing like Browning, and I can tell you today, this guy is so close to Browning. He claims to have never done any real in-depth study of Browning's patents. He said he did not has never seen the 1927 Grand Rendiment patent, but when Slav and I have designed, for example, our BH Advanced trigger subassembly, which is a complete redesign of the whole trigger subassembly in high power, I can tell you, Leon Hubert thinks the same. When he was referencing design elements of our trigger subassembly, he was using John Browning's language and directional ways of thinking, um, with us, in that design and in the whole approach to the design, and it was unmistakable to me because I've just been like this, this junkie, where John Browning's patents are concerned, because they're just so rich in learning material. I want to get to a couple of other questions. I think I've got that one there answered. I have a pair of your masterpieces, full checkered. Love them. Thank you very much. I recently picked up a European police trade-in and Red 84B. Right. It's really nice. Is they don't shoot them. They don't shoot them there. I do want to let you know about that. We have coming. I can't tell you exactly when, but the product is developed. It's a manufacturing order at this point, and it's a matter of time. But we have BDA 380 springs coming, and the crazy thing again, this sort of parallel of Leon Hubert and John Browning, the BDA 380 will, unlike the Browning high power, the BDA 380 will continue functioning for an extreme long time, and we don't yet know how long, on its original springs. This is not a good idea just because it can. Much can be said the same for every John Browning pistol design I know. Um, Again, not that it's optimal, but these guys did not prescribe springs in locations and applications where the spring was definitely doing more job than it had ass behind it to do it. Um, the P35 or Browning High, or the Browning High Powers external extractor spring, as an example. This is too big of a job for too little spring, and that's the reason why that spring needs to be replaced as often as it does. And it is it's critical. It's um, one of the traits of John Browning's firearms that we have found is if you never ever change the springs, it may never cause you a direct malfunction. It will shorten the life of the firearm. It will displease you from the standpoint of how hard the recoil happens, and the handling of the gun won't be necessarily that great when the springs are just past their useful life. But actual malfunctions caused by tired springs is so rare in a John Browning firearm, and it is rare, and I've never experienced it or heard of it in any BDA 380. But the one thing that is extremely, extremely noticeable is when you change those springs out, you appreciate it and you know it and you love it, because all of a sudden, the slide rack's different, the trigger feels different, the reset trigger feels different. If you manually cock the hammer, that feels different. Everything that moves feels different. Recoil definitely feels different. The authority of the slide going back into battery feels different, feels right, feels better, crisp. So in all of those handguns, if you are really, running any John Browning or Leon Hubert design on too tired of springs, you're going to pay for that somewhere. you're going to have premature wear of parts, or you're going to have eventually a possibility of a catastrophic frame or slide failure if it gets too bad. Um, but again, about the BDA 380, and it carries over to the Beretta 84. Um, the whole Beretta 80 series, the Beretta 92 itself. Boy, when you think about what got away from FN, and the designer behind it that designed it being Leon Hubert. Boy, I mean, I'm telling you, they were in a rock and a hard place in 1976 or in 1975, 1974, when they wanted the BA380 produced and they had to shop it because they didn't have any production capacity in order to make it. Um, uh, Jay, uh, we've seen Jay's competition model. It's been a resident at it wasn't the high power medic at the time, but the FFL we were working with at prior to the high power medic. My brother has my dad's BDA 380 from the 60s. Uh, Actually, it wouldn't be from the 60s because production didn't start until 76, if I'm not mistaken. All of it is OGE guards it like a hawk. Won't let get my hands on it. Understand? I had a father like that too. That was just the way it was. Uh, I'm just happy we have new Turkish makers of high powers to help continue it into the future affordably. Yeah, you know what we are too, um, and honestly, they give us a lot of work because there are none of them that are not needy. They're needy in say different ways sometimes, but all of them are reverse engineered, and it is it'd be another live stream for a couple of hours anyway, um, about why it is impossible to perfectly reverse engineer a high power pistol. And I assure you, I can prove beyond any shadow of any doubt in anybody's mind. And I know this sounds stupid crazy in 2026, but I don't care. If you have all of the money and technology in China and all the AI to go with it, you will not pick up any Browning high power specimen and reverse engineer a perfect high power by doing that. And the reason is because it is impossible. And for tonight, you'll have to take my word for that. That's the, but we've had this proven to us multiple times now. We had one gentleman with us with us kind of as a loose partner, I guess you'd say, for a while, that was sure that he could get an FM detective site, I think, reverse engineered. He had a guy with a 3D scanner, and he had sold him completely on this idea that he could perfectly reverse engineer everything, slide all the slide assembly parts, and he wanted $5,000. And our friend that was with us, by that point, we had already had it proven to us that this was an impossible thing to do. Um, and we tried to explain that to him, and he dropped the 5,000, and there was not one single possible usable piece of technology that resulted from that, not of anything. The parts, the slide itself, barrel, nothing was usable in any tangible, meaningful way for our purposes, nor would it have been usable effectively for anyone else's purposes. And the I'm going to give you a loose reason, okay, why this is true. Uh, there are in the high power blueprints themselves are tolerance expectations that are um, even by standards unrealistic to do on a mass scale. And there were what you would call fudge tolerances. And the fudge tolerances were we can pass this through if it's in the fudge tolerance, but the goal here is the dimension and the tolerances, meaning plus or minus whatever it is, which is normally into the very small digit hundredth of a millimeter, throughout the high power. And and if you don't get these tolerances right, it doesn't work right. Well, okay, so you reverse engineer this high power, and there's about 10 points probably in every high power that the tolerance of something somewhere goes into the fudge tolerance. This is into the point where the designer and the engineers have said, when you're making extractors, you know, yes, the blueprint prescribes these tolerances, but you can go this much above those and you can go this much below those, and that is it. Okay, so you reverse engineer one of these, anybody's high power, and you take a dimension of a particular part, and it is right at the bottom of the tolerance allowance, and you reverse engineer that dimension absolutely perfectly, and then you apply normal production tolerances to that, so say plus or minus 0.05 millimeters as an example. That becomes your acceptable. Well, if you reverse engineer something that is already at the bottom of the tolerance, and that's a part that needs to be big enough, and then apply tolerances to that low tolerance number, all of a sudden you're making parts that are too small to perform effectively. And but the challenge is you reverse this perfectly, everything. And so commonly it's impossible to find exactly where to start looking for what went wrong. And to say that this is a hair raising type of a thing to reverse engineer, is just even an understatement. I mean, there's no way to even adequately even explain this. But this is the core reason every time that, when the SA35 came out, the Gersans came out, and we decided to do an evaluation and analysis on this new high power coming to market, it was never a question if we would find deficiencies. Okay, that is just the nature of this beast if you try to reverse engineer it. And the 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 it's never been a question if there's going to be deficiencies, just how many, how bad, how much, and hopefully they've not went the wrong way to where you have something somewhere where there is too little metal in existence in a critical slide spot or a critical frame spot, because still today it's not effective to try to add metal somewhere. You can remove, but you can't add. And fortunately today we can take all of those Turkish high powers and we can create a high power that is every bit as John Browning level reliable as any high power FN or Browning ever sold and produced. But it's because of the access to all of the superior components that we have, and um, and because when we need to go in and re-engineer an extractor region in the image of an FN Browning, we know what it should look like, and we know what the tolerance should be. We know what the dimensions should be. Without that, we would not be able to do anything like what we do. Again, having that origin technology, we have found, is just insanely invaluable when it comes to the subject of the high power pistol, because without it, you are relegated to reverse engineering something that is just absolutely. If there is one thing that I can say about Dieudonné Save is, he made the high powers technology extremely difficult to work with. It's virtually reverse engineer proof. If you were to be handed just the entire copy, and it's huge, of the blueprints, the origin blueprints for the high power pistol, and you were handed them, unless you happened to know the fictitious points in space that you're measuring starts from, the numbers are meaningless. It is absolutely insane. This, again, I consider to be probably the most protected firearms technology in just layers of this type of stuff that was meant to do just one thing, and that is make this technology bulletproof to use. Uh, uh, or it was just it was considered just highly, uh, and why not? I mean, look, I mean, it built FN into the company that they today have become, which is one of the most influential firearms makers on the planet, including their production here in the United States. And there's a very, very, very strong argument that without that background of the high power pistol, FN probably doesn't have a factory here in the United States now. It's the high power and its legacy, and especially its volume for so many years that really made that possible. Um, it would also help the VHS continue. Oh, I'm sorry, BDAs do show up on Gunbroker from time to time at reasonable prices. Yes, they do. Um, I think um, right now the used gun market on say Gunbroker, I think it's down 20 or 25% compared to say just a year or two ago. I think this is without a doubt the best opportunity I've seen to pick up high powers. And I mean FN Brownings. Um, I call it origin technology high powers, including your Argentinians, your Bulgarians, your Canadians, Hungarians. All of those being, having been made from origin technology, they have a and the fact that they're not being made anymore, so the supply is of course limited. Those are what I would consider to be highly desirable today if you can find them right. And if you happen to be watching, that there are ones that come up and they are very attractively priced, relatively speaking. Um, uh, okay, don't know how does Mark III guys are able to get such a positive reset click. Okay, good question. Um, there is that's not a simple thing. If you have the BH advanced trigger subassembly, you're going to have a decisive reset click happen. That's one thing. Um, if you have a magazine disconnect installed, that is part of your reset equation, and it will cause the trigger to reset faster, and you may hear a click. That click is the as the trigger is going forward, your trigger lever is coming down and it's basically being released by the sear lever. And once it clears the sear lever, it moves to the back of the little channel area on the side of the frame where the trigger lever or trigger pawl lives. And that trigger pawl or trigger lever resetting and that click, that's what you hear that's making that click sound. If you got a bunch of grease or black stuff built up in that area, it can hide the click because it can actually stop you from having that metal to metal contact when the trigger lever moves to its back, reset position. Okay. Another one is if you do not have a magazine disconnect and you do have a trigger return spring that is being that is causing interference with your trigger pin that goes through the frame, and the original trigger subassembly. That's one of the things we designed out of the BH Advanced trigger subassembly was that the trigger from the pinch to the trigger. That does not help you have more of a reset click because it causes you to reset slower. It just causes interference, generally. Okay, going to see other questions. Guys, thank you for the participation very much. I really appreciate it. It really helps me on this. Uh, don't know how to say it. Uh, an 84, a Beretta 84B in remarkably good condition for under $300. I'd like to buy about 10 of those. That is quite the good. Let's see here. Holy, so it's moving the pinhole and welding up the old. Man, I was thinking about no, no. You can't do this as an afterthought with the same steer lever in your gun. Don't do that. You may be endangering yourself for firing upon loading or high efficiency trigger pulling, also known as more than one bullet leaving the end of the barrel per trigger pull. So don't try. Yes, you can drill another hole, but you also need to manufacture a sear lever that's going to correspond to that and be safe in all respects. And using an existing sear lever, that's not how this is. That's not going to work for you, is what I'm saying. But I can tell you, if that was possible, we would have we would have already been there. Um, Man, was FN some hard headed fools. Um, yeah, I'm not going to call them hard headed that, but very, 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 very. Uh, Look, they had the world by the tail. And they were becoming increasingly successful by making that one handgun and making it the way they had always made it. And there's so many. If it's broke, don't fix it. How many times have you heard that before? I mean, in their position of dominance in those days, there would be an awful, awful, awful lot of support for if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And but again, hey, just because you're dominant doesn't mean you stop getting better. Um, my counter to that is, well, you can keep on doing what you've always done, but your competition isn't going to keep on doing what they've always done if they're trying to catch you, and eventually they will. And that was um, that was the point, in my opinion, where um, FN blew it with respect to the high power pistol and caused themselves a boatload of problems. And that is, nobody ever said you had to change your, you know, coveted high power, but to not innovate when you have a Leon Hubert in house, to not improve, to not change, and adapt to the market, so to say. The SFS system was, that was a Leon Hubert design inside FN when he was at FN. That's how far back this goes. In 1988, FN's European catalog had an SFS high power in it. And it was, you could obviously tell they were seeing this as the next generation high power, and it directly addressed the United States concealed carry market that likes condition one. And they had it, and they had it on a gun. 5,000 of them they built in 2003 and four, and most of them came to the United States. And they turned around and bought the SFS systems from Leon Hubert after they allowed him to leave and take with him so much of his design work that they never and knew they would never use and never intended to use. Yes, this is a conglomeration, and boy, my goodness, when you think of having the high power pistol, 92 countries, worldwide dominance, and a system like the SFS system, which could have marketed it at all, could have become a real rage, like a wonder in semi-auto single action pistols, both high powers and 1911s both. Um, they had the technology, they had the designer, but they weren't flexible. And they, if let me say it like this, if they could have seen in the mid 80s what we see today, and what I mean is, you go into virtually any gun store in this country, guys, if they have multiple display cases, you just know there's at least one devoted to nothing but 1911s. It wasn't that way back in the 1980s. But if there could if there could have been a forward vision that could have even had a clue or anticipated the ongoing success of the 1911 design, um, I believe they would have made a lot of different choices and a lot of different um, strategies that they did embrace would have been unthinkable. Quite frankly. Okay, so you get to let me run through just a couple of other things here in the comments and address any of these. And guys, again, thank you for participating very, very much. Um, I thought maybe a longer trigger paw and some well filler on the fat side, shorten everything up and see what reflect. My man, I don't know. I don't think so, though. I think you. We're still back to the can you alter an existing trigger lever? Um, this has been done on a micro scale. I don't remember if it was one of the guys, Cylinder and Slider, or somebody else, and this has been years and years and years and years ago. But they had basically copied Leon's sear lever out of the competition model, and they were selling a plan for the drill hole or whatever. But again, I run back to that one, and it was much, 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 much later. If Leon had to do the competition model over again, there's one change he would make for sure, and that is that sear lever would be a drop safe sear lever, or it would at least have an internal spring like our Type 1 safety sear lever with spring, so that the sear lever itself is not floating and coming in contact with the sear every time the slide goes home. So that's another thing that I would caution is um, you know for us today, anything with a Type 1 sear lever in it, we think it needs a spring because it needs a spring. It needs to be positively positioned because that floating sear lever directly violates Browning's commandments, specifically in his last pistol patent, which was the sear lever must not be. See, John Browning did design that idea of a trigger paw, a sear lever contacting a sear and working in the coordination loosely that they do relationally exactly as they do, but different design. But the concept was pioneered by John Browning in his last pistol patent, and he stressed how important it is to the sear lever must not be contacting the sear until it is manipulated to do so by the trigger. And when that sear lever is floating, it's violating that. And that's the reason why the Type 1 sear lever models, the reason the core reason that the high powers trigger always had to be so damn hard is because the sear spring was overmade because it had to resist that sear lever popping on top of the sear, contacting it, slamming it every time the slide goes home and goes forward. So the sear spring itself needed to be one that stabilized that sear against the force of that. Now, if that Type 1 floating sear lever gets gummed up and it no longer floats, so to say, it sort of moves, whatever, now it has resistance. It starts hitting the sear harder. Your sear spring starts to tire over time, and all of a sudden one day you rack your slide, release it, and kaboom, and you never touch the trigger. Or you pull a trigger and this thing all of a sudden finds its own happy switch, and you have high efficiency trigger pulling. Those things happen with those Type 1 sear levers, and when they're positively positioned by a spring, that does not happen. And so I would also throw that in as a caution, because normally if you're talking about doing something like this, you are talking about one of the Type 1 sear levers, and typically those are floating unless you have one of ours with a spring in it. And again, this is really into dicey territory to even start going there. The construction of the Type 1 sear trigger lever, even if it's modified, even if there's one that's got the hole not in the center and it's just placed to give leverage to the skinny kid. Even then, that part needs to be made as light as possible, and I'm talking weight, because you just don't want any more mass hitting that sear than possible, because then you have to have, and it's critical. So if you even go to the point, of trying to copy uh, Leon's steer lever out of a competition model, um, and you want to, see if you can have somebody machine one of those for you. I'm not saying it's over your head. I'm saying um, I don't believe that part actually has to be steel, number one. But number two, the lightest possible material that you can. And I think it has to be, higher on the hardness realm than aluminum. But my vote would be for anything that is hardened to the same level of hardness as a typical steer lever and a high power, but the lightest possible material is going to be the safer way to go with that. Having an internal spring is the best. Um, Polishing everything at SFS and BH advanced trigger system get really close to my competition level as far as trigger pull and better reset for the standard high powers. Thank you, Jay. I think you are right. Now, the ironic thing about what you just said about that whole combination of things right there, it's all Leon Hubert. The trigger subassembly, my partner, we both took a share of the credit for the design work that went into our trigger subassembly. The origin of that whole inspiration, if you will, was Leon Hubert. And he presented to us a prototype. And this prototype was not like what we eventually brought to market as our BH Advanced trigger. What he provided to us was basically an equivalent trigger to a Browning high power thin profile trigger, and and redesigned trigger pawl, essentially, in the same attachment and pivot method that is in our trigger, um, and trigger return spring, and there was only a little what I would call magazine eject assist. The second spring related to the trigger pawl so that there was a magazine disconnect. And so his original prototype and his original design did include the function of a magazine disconnect. However, that magazine disconnect was all spring, all being done by the spring and its pressure on the trigger lever. The magazine face would pick that spring up as the magazine went in and lift it off of the trigger lever entirely, which would allow the trigger lever then to go back to its position. You take the magazine out. Now that spring comes down, contacts the trigger lever, and by angle caused it to go forward. So you couldn't fire the weapon with the magazine out. That design, in trying to overcome the dimensional differences in that area, and the specific area I'm talking about is in and around the trigger, and specifically for the trigger where your trigger return spring mounts or leverages itself ahead of the trigger inside the frame. That platform has varying heights, dimensions, widths, depths, different, lesser and more, depending on the generation of FN high power, depending on the manufacturer, depending on if it's an Argentinian, it's different there. They were able to allow a lot of different stuff to go through on that dimension because the original trigger return spring wasn't so sensitive to pressure, how it was pressured by that platform. And what we found was Leon's original design was, you didn't really have, frankly, that much magazine eject assist function. It did because the magazine picked up the spring going up, but the front face of the magazine picked it up instead of where we have it engaged with that spring. And what we found was control of the trigger lever depending on what high power it went into, was either reliable or there was no way to overcome all of the differences in the different high powers of history and have our trigger subassembly be functional in all of them and retain that magazine disconnect interaction with the trigger pulse. So in Slav's living room one night after dinner, um, we decided that we would change this and not have that trying to interact with the trigger pawl, because it seemed like we were trying to do too much with what we were working with, and make and dedicate that spring to nothing except magazine eject assist, which you can use that spring and have it or not, but it doesn't change your trigger pull either way whatsoever. And that was a big contributional change by Slav and myself. And when we did that, that original spring that Leon had designed became a totally completely different spring entirely, um, and and again dedicated to doing nothing but making your magazines leave the handgun with that trigger. So um, but yeah, it's interesting, Jay, that basically the way you're getting a standard high power to be extremely close to your trigger in your competition model, and Leon Hubert is involved in every single bit of it, the competition model and everything you're doing to a standard high power. So, um, he's the guy that gets things that direction. Um, Okay, let's see if there's anything else here I can address. I'm glad you guys are having the conversations that you're having. Well, okay, I'm a '70s child. I am too. Uh, love them. Thank you for the endorsement there about our triggers. We appreciate that very much. We've got those getting ready to go back into production. I want to tell you, this has been a year like no other for trying to get things produced inside the United States. It seems like every defense contractor, if every manufacturer, machinist, if they have defense contracts or they're a subcontractor to a defense contractor, guys, we're living in a different world. It's just been a lot of military demand for stuff, I guess, this year, and it's gotten in the way of production for us repeatedly. Um, a real microphone would help Mark's audio immensely. Thank you very much. That will be taken under consideration and acted on. Thank you. Uh, the level of quality of the Turkish slides, frames, etc. The rest can be easily replaced. Upgrade. Yeah. Um, the comment here is, I'm amazed at the level of quality of the Turkish slides and frames, etc. The rest can be easily replaced. Upgrade. Yes. Yeah. Um, uh, Tissos did have some problems. I believe, well, we believe that Tissos is the manufacturer of the slides, frames, components of the Springfield SA-35. At least we've been told it by their importer. Um, and they had I've seen a frame or a slide or something that had a fracture or whatever. But um, by and large, yes, we have hardness tested virtually everything in every high power clone that's come out. We have communicated that to Leo Hubert, and he has given his endorsement as that's okay. Again, if you are looking at a Browning high power, you're going to have these what I would call optimal hardness levels for every single thing, and the prescriptions are extremely precise and they are extremely optimal. Um, does it have to be that level of optimal? Not necessarily. And he has said that that the hardness levels that they're generally working with are okay. They are um, they are machining a lot of preheat treated steel. That's one thing that we do believe we can say for sure, that they are doing a lot of work with pre-hardened material. As a machinist, I'm always amazed at how parts were made back in those days without modern machine tools. Brother, I'm telling you, you are 100%. You are screaming to the choir. Um, it's incredible how they did it, but see this the what they had to do back in the day was they had to design and invent a machine or tool or whatever it was to do a specific job. And once they perfected it, they got pretty good. But this, you're not talking about tooling that like we're producing on today, where a CNC machine is working on something for Mark and Slot now, and it's working on somebody's wheel bearing or something tomorrow. And the machines are highly adaptable. This was a whole different uh, way of having to do things, back then. Um, all right. Yes, respect for the old guys and their skills. Ditto. Um, so is it pinning the mag disconnect in to keep the click? Um, no, no. The 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 let me explain it like this. We frequently have had guys say that, hey, I installed your two coil trigger return spring, and we're talking about now traditional trigger subassembly. I installed your two coil trigger return spring, and all of a sudden I have this click sound when I reset, and I like that. And generally, yes, that is desirable. Um, when that spring is optimally made, number one, you don't have any interference with the stationary. The trigger return spring is installed in the trigger pivots. That means the spring has to move. If you have a stationary pin mashing that spring, or frankly contacting it, encountering it in any way, this is when your issues with your trigger start, so to say. It's also the reason they had to groove your trigger pin. It's got that sort of groove in the middle of it. A lot of people that think that's so the trigger return spring will keep the trigger pin in the gun. No, like when it gets loose after you've installed or uninstalled it 20 times. It's not for that at all. And in fact, what they're trying to do is they're trying to have no contact between the trigger and the trigger return spring, and it's a problem, or they wouldn't be grooving that trigger pin, and it wouldn't be there. Um, that was the first, what I would call truly almost insurmountable challenge of a spring for Mark and Slot to make, and the perfection of that production of our trigger return spring for the high power happened about 3 feet to my left on a Indy 500 race day, Sunday. And here in central Indiana, we normally never saw the Indy 500 on television because it was blacked out here. So I always listened to it on the radio. So that particular Sunday, I'm listening to the race about 3 feet to my left, and I'm devising the production requirements and the testing for every single trigger return spring that is made for us has to be hand tested, and it has to hit a certain part of the gauge. And if it does not, then the angles are not correct. And what will happen is you will have contact with that trigger pin. If you have contact with the trigger pin, it affects everything basically the tail of the trigger return spring does, including its authority and pressure on the trigger lever. So to understand the trigger lever is when your slide reciprocates back like this and starts back forward, your sear lever, the end of your sear lever, not the bottom part that engages with your trigger lever when it pushes up, but the end piece, the end part of your sear lever, your trigger lever the slide is reciprocated before you've even gotten close to releasing. And it comes back forward, the trigger lever is up, and the front face of that sear lever picks up the trigger lever and pushes it forward. You release the trigger lever comes down, and then it pops back in its channel in the frame. And when that metal contacts the metal, that's what makes that click sound. And the trigger return spring is what is commanding that trigger lever to get back into position to fire again. And The authority that that trigger return spring has is largely based on its ability, number one, to do its job. Number two, the thickness of the spring wire. That's why you will not get as much of that kind of click sound out of our three coil trigger return spring, because it's number one, it's thinner spring wire. It still resets the trigger lever very, very competently and no problem, but not with the sort of authority of the two coil, which has more of the effect of, it's just real authoritative once that trigger lever has come down below the face or the front part of your steer lever coming forward. It clears that and it's able to then reset. So if everything in the system is right, and no, this is not dependent on the magazine disconnect at all. The magazine disconnect, because when you pull like this, you are in essence compressing and pulling up that magazine disconnect face on the magazine. That release of the trigger and the forward motion of the trigger means that that magazine disconnect spring is decompressing too, and it becomes part of what you feel as authority in the reset. But it doesn't help that click sound happen or not. Again, best with our two coil trigger return spring, and by far best with our spring. We have found in some of the new Turkish clones, their trigger return springs are not made well, and a lot of what we encounter that is trigger stuff going on in some of those is trigger return spring pinned, basically, or basically instead of the trigger return spring in its horizontal part, you've got this curve, and then it coils, so it will hold on to the trigger return spring pin, and then it comes down, goes flat, comes back up and over the trigger lever. That part at the bottom that is horizontal, that's what goes under your trigger lever. And if the angle going down or the angle coming back up, either one can cause that trigger return spring to raise at that bottom point. And if it does, it is now pressing upward on a stationary pin. That spring has to be able to move. And that spring gets its charge from the front end of the spring that starts, like this, anchors in what I call the trigger spring well area. The pressure of that is what charges the spring at the center coils and is what causes the downward pressure of the trigger return spring on the trigger lever. And the better pressure you have there, the more authoritatively it's going, faster it's going to reset that trigger lever. And again, you have a metal contact metal, and there's your click. Anything that gets in the way of that is going to interfere with having that, say, positive click sound on the reset. Okay. The reference there to the 1903 effing got started with JMB's 1903 version that Colt didn't want in the beginning. Then when Colt saw how well it was doing in Europe, I don't believe there was a 1903 made in Europe, but I could be wrong. The ones I've known about Europe were 1899 and subsequently the 1900s as being the first, and then you had the vest pockets, and then followed by the 1910 in terms of Browning pistols at FN. But I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not familiar exactly with that relational part of history with that particular model having had its origins at FN by Browning. To me, it was just silly. FN didn't just let Leon Hubert do his thing and experiment on proving the hype and then compare the difference versus cost to implement. I have to tell you, in my opinion, Leon Hubert was the real forward thinker at the time, and the suits, the execs at FN were not the forward thinkers necessarily, in my opinion, at that time. Um, you might have noticed FN gave up on the P-35 high power. Leon Hubert never has yet. Most of those guys who gave up on it back in the day are dead. Hubert's still with us. So, sometimes time does, sort this stuff out and, prove who might have been, on the right side of history. Um, so they just kept putting out the same 75-year-old design with its much less than optimal trigger. Yes. 1927, 1935. Yep. Okay, I don't see any other questions here that we can run to. Okay, so I'd love to have original HP. Um, okay, lots of specialized fixtures names. Yes, yes. Um, One of the things that is really really hard to stomach and hard to handle is we've been told. I can't confirm this as absolute fact, but I would be willing to put a lot of money on the likelihood that this source was very reliable. Um, but it sounds to us like that all the tooling for the high power was destroyed by FN at FN, and I don't know that to be fact, but I'm fairly sure that's true. Um, let's roll back forward in history, and guys, we're gonna wrap this up for the night. Um, okay, so you get 1990 comes along, the whole world has changed. The Mark III high power with a drop safety, which is not really that exciting to the market, came out fine. In my opinion, the best high powers of history are definitely the Mark III, and that is a complete blueprint effort by, again, Leon Hubert. And I believe that the Mark III is the best high power of history, and specifically because of his input and because of his um, ways he was able to help the design, with the Mark III. Um, the 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 directionalism inside FN was very multi-directional. In other words, I think to a great extent, nobody could tell who was driving the train. Nobody was, it just they didn't look very, decisive about their directionalism, and there was a ton of stuff going on in the market, and there's no way to compete with Glock now, and they've been in the market 10 years, and they're trying to take market share, and there's a lot of stuff going on. They're trying to read the tea leaves, and they decided, well, okay, we got to have a 40 high power. There had been an effort to convert, um, and I think even Browning for a very very short time was even on this train, but it was a very very short time. There was a round called the 41 AE, the 41 Action Express, which is a doggone impressive round that is amazing that it never took off. But every once in a while, you'll see a 41 AE high power barrel will show up somewhere like on Gunbroker or whatever. These were not a good thing in a high power pistol in the existing 9mm high power pistols at all. But the confounding thing to me, and has always been, I mean, I guess I understand it with the Israelis, but because they're such a committed condition 3 environment, they did not want to spring the high power any stiffer because it interferes with coming out of a holster, racking the slide as fast as possible. That's why they made a Karine Mark II and a Mark III with a heavier slide that, a 15-pound recoil spring is about all you want to go, lest you risk short cycling. That was a great fit for their times in their culture. The 41 AE and the high power, in my opinion, could have been fine. It just needed a different recoil spring system. It needed a Leon Hubert full length guide rod, dual sprung recoil spring guide rod to control that energy. Because without doing that, there was just no way that the 9mm high power was going to stand up to that kind of power. But they wanted, then the 40 became all the rage, and it looked like you're not going to be in the market unless you're chambered in 40. Leon started the 40 project, and they took it away from him. And the Browning R&D guys and engineers finished that. So your 40 Smith and Wesson high power, those actually have the Browning Arms Company design work going that is going into those. Leon Hubert didn't finish the 40. It's one of the reasons why we've come out now with a full length guide rod that can go into your 40 Smith and Wesson high power that makes all the improvements. Leon knew exactly when we started talking to him about that subject. He knew exactly what to do. In other words, it seemed to be like something he had figured out before that design was taken away from him. And he didn't need any time to think about this. He knew exactly where to go, exactly what to do, exactly how to do it, and it is a beautiful, beautiful upgrade in a 40. Best thing I've ever done in my 40 is that full length guide rod. Easier to rack, super easy to install and uninstall, better recoil control. I mean, it's just a better system in your 40. Again, Leon Hubert. And I can't say that Slav and I had anything to do with that one, except the spring prescription. We did prescribe that, but everything else about that product, that is completely Leon Hubert design work generally. So 1990 comes. The FN is living in an entirely different world. The world is looking completely different. Browning was never, less interested in selling a high power pistol. But Browning had very, very little input about those guys. They didn't have the influence. FN's designer ultimately designed this gun in the very beginning. It was considered an FN product, even though, in our country it was called the Browning High Power. It was very, all I got the feeling, under FN's control. They're the ones who had the capability to produce it, to manufacture it. And Browning here in the United States was not going to be replacing all that tooling on their own and manufacturing. There was never any risk of that. So FN starts now into the 90s, and things are not getting better. And as our understanding has been enriched about this subject, 1993 came along, and FN was developing financial problems. And it was blamed on, guess what, guys? The high power. Now, isn't this a sour punchline? You imagine now you have been dominant, you're still in 90 something countries, and you are famous and you're not selling any guns. Can't win the bidding wars. And other guns are, seem to be passing the test just like you're passing the test, and there's no contracts coming in. And it looks like the firearm that built the dynasty is now, depleting and killing the dynasty. And financial problems will cause people to make changes and changes in direction. And the decision, you can see this in FN's history and where things went with Browning and where things went with FN after 1993 specifically. There was never another metal handgun design that was brought to market that I know of, designed at FN until in 2000, whatever, 22, I guess. FN come out with what I call accidentally the Anchor, the 40 ounce to HIGH power. There's not been any more metal handguns. There's been nobody there designing them. Leon Hubert left, and he turned out the lights, and the metal frame handgun world sort of came to a slow grind halt. The way that we have seen this is, as of about 1993, FN would have had about 25 years of servicing requirements left on their contract sales of high powers. And if you do the math from 1993 until 2018, 25 years. And 25 years virtually to the day from the time Leon Hubert left until the high power, the lights were completely turned out. Browning discontinued it. FN stopped offering it. It was 25 years. So what I'm telling you is the decision that Browning made in 2018 had nothing to do with Browning. Browning had no input about FN continuing to manufacture or not manufacture the high power pistol. That was FN's decision, and it in essence was made in 1993. And when Leon Hubert left, part of the arrangement that they made with Leon Hubert, because he was a very, very, very highly respected and regarded person inside FN, um, nearly to the level of John Browning and Dia de Maysave. And he left there on absolutely perfect terms with them. He remains on perfect terms with them today. And there was an opportunity for him to leave, and for many of his designs that FN had never decided to bring to market and produce, and some of them that they actually had, um, was able to leave and go with Leon as his own property. It was his work after all in the beginning, but to leave, with that being his own property. And in fact, it was even FN who helped him patent some stuff. They assisted him that way. So quite exemplary, Leon Hubert's exit from FN. Um, in by 1993, FN was reading the tea leaves well enough to know that we're going to have to be in a polymer pistol market, because everybody's choosing their service firearms based on the lowest bidder. And it was not 1910 anymore, where you show up and you have the gun in 1911 that shoots 6,000 rounds with no malfunctions, and you win the pistol competition, and then it's time to see how much is it going to cost the government to have this, which John Browning made it way too easy, frankly. Those days were gone, and those days were gone by the 1980s, and they're still gone. If you cannot win the bidding war, you're not going to get the contracts. That's just a hard fact of life when it comes to institutional use of firearms, military security forces, and so forth. And they were understanding this, and they were understanding the economics of it. That there's no way you're going to compete with a $4 grip frame with an all metal, all steel handgun, and they just did not see a way home to competitiveness in the market that built them, which was not the United States consumer market. It was the worldwide fame around the high power pistol that really is when FN was able to take off in a meaningful kind of volume way that became sort of a consuming virtually. Um, uh, I think it really, um, speaks volumes. It rather than Browning discontinued the high power in 2018 because FN wasn't going to supply them any more high powers, and that was it. That was 25 years FN had been staying in the high power market only because they had servicing requirements on firearms in so many places in the world. It took them 25 years to get out from underneath that obligation. So until then, they kept making parts because they kept supplying replacement parts to armies and militaries and their customers around the world. So why, since we got to make all the parts for this thing to send out to our customers when they want to do whatever they do, we might as well be putting these things together, shipping. I think they got to the last like 10 or 12 years the high power was sold in the United States. There was only like 22 to 2,500 of them sent into the United States on a yearly basis. It was just it was almost nothing. Nighthawk Custom was taking down 600 of those, and so there was very, very, very little penetration. But again, they were making for the U.S. market based on just a very small amount of production that was necessary for them to service their existing institutional customers that were still hanging on and using the high powers at that time. And as long as you got to keep doing that, and you've got these servicing requirements, you might as well keep assembling some guns and sending them over to the United States so Browning can sell some. And that's what they were doing. It was not any longer regarded as a profit center for them, and it was not they were trying to make it a profit center because they knew that they had made a decision back in '93 that they were going to be leaving that market and going headfirst into polymer frame handguns. And you will recall from history, that's when you saw the Browning Pro 9 come out. It was a polymer frame handgun. FN had the same gun, different name or nomenclature. Um, and they have refined that ever since. And I just want to say they do an outstanding job at making the firearms that they still make. They have integrity, in my opinion. I have nothing negative in the world to say about it, and absolutely nothing negative in the world to say about the Browning Arms Company. We consider those folks our dear friends, frankly. Um, one of the descendants of John Browning, one of his great grandsons, is a personal friend of ours. We've had the occasion to meet. We've had the occasion to. It's just been a great, relationship with him, and getting to know him. And he, there's no direct Browning family involvement in the Browning Arms Company anymore, but descendants and family members do get some perks, and they do get some knowledge, and they do get, some nice treatment and everything, and it's nice to hear about and learn from. Um, but the truth is, Browning had nothing to do with this. And there, as I understand it, there were very, very displeased people inside Browning. For example, when the Auto 5 shotgun was discontinued for whatever reason it was. There were a lot of people who were very, very displeased with FN about that, and a lot of displeased people inside Browning, about FN, discontinuing the high power pistol. But again, the reality is it was a business decision by FN. They believed that the market was moving in a way that for them to remain competitive into the future, they had to go a different direction entirely, and which obviously they have, and they are still around, and Browning is still around, and still today, a lot of us think, my gosh, boy, what are you doing? You think a high power is not marketable, and then you see what is coming into the United States being imported from Turkey today, and it's like, it's the greatest thing that people's ever heard of, and they're selling a ton of them. And of course, the price point is a part of that as well. But from the standpoint of from FN and Browning's perspective, they did not see a way back to profitability. But again, I really, really, really strongly reference you to one thing: is FN never stopped believing in the gun, ever. I know this for a fact. Browning Arms Company never stopped believing in that firearm, not for a second. And it was not a matter of them not believing in their own product. It was, I believe, and I do know, it was a matter for them. They did not believe in the business environment that was evolving in the early 90s. They did not believe they could see a pathway back to the kind of volume that is necessary for profitability of the production that they had, stood on for so long. And they did not have or see any obvious answers or a pathway from a business standpoint to how do we get back to the level of volume that it takes to be profitable with a handgun that is this complex and this expensive to make. And they just weren't seeing it. And from that perspective, from that single perspective, maybe they made the right decision. I would sure not personally lean that direction. But what I am suggesting is, I think it's completely understandable why they did what they did, and why they thought they needed to do what they did. The economics of it, and the fact that other handguns were getting very, very good traction in the market, and they were beating FN on price, and they were passing all the tests. FN had their back against the fall guys. I mean, that's the way I look at this, is they had hedged their bets years and years ago on a very popular need in the market at that time when it was born in 1935. It was a true need. I mean, and they were dominant because of what this pistol could do. And they hedged and invested into making it, 100%, and it paid off, and it paid off for a very, very, very long time. But when the day was over, that dominance was no longer there. Which again, from a business standpoint, there's a big thing to learn here, and that is, you know, when you get on top, staying on top is harder than getting on top or getting to the top. I can say this from my own personal business experiences, and that is. Um, um, Becoming the number one sales leader in a company, as just as an example, that is easier than it is to stay there. That's you become who everybody starts shooting at, and who everybody starts trying to beat. And that was FN's position, and they stayed in a top dominant position for decades. But again, true to form, it's much harder to stay there than it is to get there, so to say. Staying there is a horse of a different color. When you are encumbered by thinking that is very regressive from the standpoint of change, of improving, of modifying and enhancing appeal and usability, and say understanding other markets. See, when you're in a position where you've licensed to two countries or three countries, four countries, whatever, to make your product because the world can't get enough, and you're making all you can make, you get um, it's it becomes an immobilizer, so to say, because why would you be investing a lot of money for new ideas to increase, sales and production of something you can't make enough of already? And you can't keep up with the demand so much so that you're licensing, this country and that country and so forth to make, in essence, the same thing. Um, I think it has a chilling effect on the urgency quotient of need to innovate, to improve. Um, it sure didn't seem to demotivate Leon Hubert necessarily. I think he always believed and understood and knew the need for that, fundamentally. But I think when you're at the top of the company and you're having to shop out production of a gun like a Beretta 84, a Browning BDA 380, and you have to shop it to somebody else because you can't produce it yourself because you don't have production capacity. My goodness, that um, yeah, that's a big problem when you start to think about it, uh, because now it almost starts to feel like you're bigger than you really maybe are. Um, uh, when you start to look at it, I think through that lens, I think it starts to make an awful lot of sense. Um, uh, but there's the reasons. The Browning high power was discontinued, if you will, um, and the way that we interpreted it was always a model. And I'm going to tell you, I'm starting to believe more and more that wherever it is ever produced, it needs to be produced with a plan for volume, or don't attempt it, because the complexities, the inevitable complexities, even if you have all of the origin technology, um, the complexities of the execution are such that the capital requirements to do it are just absolutely insane. In other words, like the initial setup cost just to machine slide. Guys, you're into six figures, and you're into six figures. It starts with three, four, five. just for the machine setup to execute a production of high power slides. And it's daunting when you start to think about it. Even with all of our technology today, in that, you don't have to produce, 15 or 20 different toolings and machines and things. You can do a whole bunch of it, on one CNC machine, and that's all fine. But in order to fully execute it, that machine setup, the fixturing and everything is still required, and it is daunting when it's looked at that way. And again, I think it is again a real prover that this is a model that was always destined to be very volume dependent. And when the volume is no longer happening, it's just the viability is just it's just disappeared. Guys, everybody, thank you for joining me this evening. I've not felt alone whatsoever. Appreciate you guys. Appreciate the BH veterans who are listening to this. We always have many hundreds of people in the first couple of days after a live stream like this who watch the replay as the permanent video, and we appreciate all of you for doing that as well. I'm very, very bad about this, but if you've watched this long, and if you're not a subscriber to our YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button. And if you liked what you heard, or if you just even like us at all, hit the like button. Appreciate that very, very much. You guys who have stayed with us, I hope you felt like you're in great company, because I want to tell you, BH veterans are the class of this entire industry, and I don't say that lightly. I've been saying that. Slav will tell you, I've been saying that ever since we first started. And my reasoning for that is, guys, Browning guys, when I was growing up, they were the class of the firearms industry, admittedly. And most of you guys are sort of at heart Browning guys, if not Browning Arms Company guys. Then John Browning, you're Browning guys, right? And you are class. And BH veterans are literally, I believe, the class of the firearms industry. And appreciate you very, 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 very much. Jay, I would love to, man. I'm exhausted, and I've got about 5 more things I've got to do. But if you can hit me tomorrow and in the morning, it'll be possible. Guys, thanks everybody very, very much. Have a great evening. Have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us this evening. We appreciate you, and good night.